this afternoon. I want to thank you for coming. Thank our candidates for being here. I want to start off with having Caroline from Never Again. Where is she? Come on then. Lead a moment of silence for the victims of the recent tragedies.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Caroline with Never Again. I'm going to start by reading a statement that we wrote about the most recent shooting. So, whereas on the morning of the 18th of May, 2018, a mass shooting occurred at Santa Fe High School in Santa Fe, Texas, and multiple teachers and students lost the opportunity to ever laugh, live, or love again. And whereas the victims of Santa Fe High School were the most recent victims among the 22 school shootings in 2018, and with Santa Fe being the most recent school shooting, and whereas on March 14th, school communities across this country, including tens of thousands of students in Colorado, walked out of classrooms to send one message: enough. We've seen enough senseless gun violence and we've lived in fear too long. We've buried too many heroes. We demand better. Whereas we're deeply saddened to see politicians tweet platitudes of thoughts and prayers and cower from actually implementing policies that could prevent mass shootings in America. And now, therefore, be it proclaimed that we, the Board of Directors of Never Again Colorado, urge all lawmakers to take immediate action so that another tragedy is prevented. We stand in solidarity with all survivors, families of survivors, and victims of gun violence here in the United States of America. And then if you all would join me in a moment of silence. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. I want to be sure and thank the Unity Center for allowing us to use this space this afternoon. Just by way of some mechanics, the restrooms are to your left as you go out to the lobby, and we will be going until 4 p.m. Our moderator is Carolyn Beninsky, and she will introduce the process and begin the process. We do have some question askers down here. You should be down close, I think, so you can come up when you're ready to ask questions. If you have a question you would like to ask, there are some 4x6 cards on the tables up front. We can bring them in, perhaps write them on there and bring them up to me, and we'll take a look and see if it's something in addition to what we have. Some of the questions that we have were put together by civic groups, and some are being asked by some of the individuals here.
And everybody, please speak close to the mic.
Will do. Dan, you can do the timing, right? Okay.
Okay, so we're going to start. I'm just going to very briefly, quickly tell you what the agenda is, and then we'll take each piece at a time. We're going to start with a 2-minute statement by candidate surrogates, which are here for Jonah Goose, Robert Barish, and Peter Yu. Then we'll do 4-minute introductory statements by the candidates who are here in alphabetical order. Michael Doherty, Democratic candidate for Boulder DA. Mike Foote, Democratic candidate for Boulder County DA. Nick Thomas, Independent candidate for Congressional House District 2. And Mark Williams, Democratic candidate for Congressional House District 2. Then there will be questions to candidates who have 2 minutes to respond. And there will be questions from high school students and from the moderator, from civics, read by me, from civic groups that have given us these questions. And then if the audience has questions as well, they'll be able to write them on 4x6 cards and bring them forward. Candidates will rotate there in terms of when they get to answer. So they can, also candidates can respond to the question. They can respond to other candidates' answer to the question to deepen it or rebut it. Or they can pass if the question doesn't apply to their office. And candidates will have 2 minutes to close for a closing statement. We have cards for the candidates. You can see we have cards, green, yellow, and red. Yellow will come up when it's 30 seconds that are left, and red means to please finish the sentence and finish up. Please withhold applause until the end in order that we have as much time as possible for the questions. And then we'll do a closing. So we will start with the brief 2-minute statements by candidate surrogates. We'll start with Joe Neguse, representative. And Joe Neguse is running for the Democratic primary for CD2.
Thank you for having me here today. My name is Katie Wallace, and I'm the field director for Joe Neguse's campaign. Joe's very sorry that he was not able to make it today, but he wanted to send me to express his deep commitment to ending gun violence in our country. Following yet another devastating attack in Santa Fe, Texas on Friday, Joe and I talked at length about the realities our generation and the generations that follow ours face when it comes to gun violence in our schools and communities. We spoke as well about the exasperating reality that the generations who came before us have lacked the political will and courage to combat the realities of gun violence in our communities. We need a new generation of leaders in Congress who understand what it is to have never really felt safe from gun violence at school, and who draw boldness and courage in this fight from that very reality. This is why Joe launched his campaign on the promise to be a tireless champion for a ban on assault weapons. The only candidate in this race to have begun their campaign on such a promise. And with Joe, we can be sure that this is not just empty words, because he has led the fight to end gun violence in our communities before. As a CU regent, Joe took on the lengthy and high-stakes battle to ban concealed carry on campuses, because it should just be common sense that we do not want guns in dorm rooms. Joe will continue this fight in Congress by working not just to ban assault weapons and bump stocks, but by finally closing the gun show loophole, raising the minimum age for gun purchases, and creating a national red flag law. The groups at the forefront of these fights in our communities know that Joe isn't the only choice to take on these battles in the halls of Congress. He is a proud Mothers Demand Action gun sense candidate and is the only congressional candidate endorsed by Congresswoman Gabby Giffords and her organization Giffords Courage to End Gun Violence. I urge you to join with these champions against gun violence in supporting Joe's campaign for Congress so that we can send a new generation with the courage to finally take action to Congress. Thank you.
Roger Barish, Libertarian candidate for CD2.
Hello. I'd like to start by thanking everybody who organized this event. I genuinely believe the intent here is to discuss more than just gun bans and actually dive a little deeper into this problem. My name is John Kyle, and I work for Roger Barish, Libertarian candidate for CD2. Roger's at a wedding this weekend out of state, but he really wishes he could be here. Instead, I'm going to read you a statement. As libertarians, we believe in the right to self-defense, as most people do. We believe it is up to you, the individual, to decide how best to defend your family and or property. To better understand how important guns are to defending oneself, we can look at the CDC study conducted under the executive order by President Obama in 2015. It shows that there's an average of between 500,000 and 3 million events where victims of crime protect themselves using their firearms every year. These weapons range from handguns, shotguns, even AR-15 rifles. Understanding this, let's move on to the issue at hand, and the reason I think we're all here today, mass shootings, specifically at schools. As we saw just 2 days ago, tragedy struck again in Texas in a small school. This time, however, an AR-15 wasn't used, and 10 kids still lost their lives far too early while others were injured. The shooter used a shortened shotgun, likely holding 5 to 7 rounds, and a .38 caliber revolver, holding another 5 rounds. The shooter also had rough explosives, like a Molotov cocktail, and CO2-based cartridge device. This should bring to light an important reality. Assault weapon bans, magazine restrictions, red flag bills, none of these proposed solutions would have stopped this tragedy. The problem lies somewhere deeper in our society and will not be an easy fix like passing legislation. An assault weapons ban will not pull assault weapons off the street. Everyone crafted, including the '94 ban that was enacted, has simply banned the sale. You will still have 30 million assault-style weapons in the country. It will not remove shotguns or handguns from people's homes. It will not prevent students using a chemistry class and online websites to build bombs. The realities will do very little to solve the problem, but will give a false sense of security and accomplishment.
That's time.
If we truly want,
You're done.
if we truly want to see a solution now, today, it has to be to secure our schools. I am not a security expert, nor do I think I or anyone has the 100% right answer to this very complex question. However, I can plainly look at the situation and realize the fastest way to solve it and to save lives is to secure the schools and ensure weapons are not easily brought in. Schools are getting out shortly, and we have a 3-month break to make some decisions.
Stop.
We need to be in our school board meetings, challenging board members to propose solutions and change the budget up and provide more security.
Thank you.
So
We
the
do need to
schools
move on.
get back in session in
You
August.
suck.
We will actually have a policy in place that can save lives. Thank you for your time.
Okay, Peter Yu, Republican for CD2.
Well, the opinions expressed here are not my own. I was asked to read this roughly 30 minutes ago. What Peter Yu sent by a text message was...
Closer to the mic, please.
Read it. I want to thank New Visions for America and Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center for the opportunity to read a statement regarding guns and gun laws in America today. I regret that I was unable to be here in person today. I was already had a prior commitment in Nebraska for a multiple sclerosis walk, and apparently his surrogate had a family emergency this morning. As a son of a family that immigrated to the United States in 1969, I am proud to be a citizen of this great nation. Being a native of Colorado, born and raised, it is my desire to be your next representative in CD2. As your representative, I want to address not only guns, but all forms of danger that are a threat to our way of life. It is my priority to make sure that every person in the country is protected and safe from danger. I believe in our country and upholding the Constitution, and that includes the Second Amendment. Unfortunately, there are people who don't care about our laws or the security of life, and Americans do have the right to arm and protect themselves from those who mean to cause harm. And looking at the discussion regarding guns, I am at a point where we need to actually address the causes of our problems and not just treating the symptoms. Our top priority should be a true evaluation of mental illness in this country. Mental illness is real and is the main culprit for so many horrific events. We also need to assist in creating support groups who can help in raising our young boys and men in our country. So many times we see boys who are angered, lost, and unable to adjust to society, and to see them act out in public. We need to go back to having gun education so that people understand how to properly use guns and how to properly store them away. And finally, we need to address the issues of drugs and gang crimes. Since I'm about out of time, I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we're going to have 4-minute introductory statements by candidates in alphabetical order, and we'll start with Michael Doherty. He's the Democratic candidate for Boulder County DA.
Good afternoon. We must reduce gun violence. We have to do more, and as district attorney, I'm committed to fighting against gun violence. I would like to be able to say before it's too late, but that moment's actually passed. And the other day, after the Santa Fe school shooting, I came home late that night to find a mailing from one of the candidates for governor, and it had a list of all the school shootings, and it said, "Who's next?" Well, that day started with the answer to that question, tragically. And as a prosecutor for the last 20 years, I've responded to too many crime scenes and seen too many victims who've been gunned down. And when we're watching our children in our schools being gunned down, we need to stand and fight against gun violence. When my phone rings in the middle of the night, it's usually because someone's been killed. And more often than not, it's due to guns. One of my phone calls that I got was after the Aurora movie theater shooting. And I went there as the head of the criminal section for the Attorney General's office, and the images that I remember from that day will be with me for the rest of my life. And after the Aurora theater shooting, we made progress with background checks and magazine limits. And as a result of that effort, 3 Democratic legislators lost their jobs. And since then, politicians on all sides have been running scared, running for office, and failing to lead the way. As a result, let me ask you this. With a show of hands, how many of you agree that we should have a red flag law where if someone has due process that shows, well, the hands are going up before I finish, but, and I think that speaks to the passion we feel about this, that shows that someone's an immediate threat to themselves or others should not have access to firearms. How many of you agree with that statement? Everyone here. You're not all,
I don't.
Okay.
I don't think we should have guns at all.
Thank you, Lynn. You're not alone. The district attorneys, law enforcement, victim advocates, and 87% of the people in the state of Colorado, 87% of the people agree with you and agree with me that we should have a red flag law. So Zachary Parrish is killed on New Year's. The legislature starts their session a couple days later. January 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, no red flag law being proposed. Parkland shooting, February 14th. 15th, 16th, 17th, no red flag law being proposed. Rather, it's introduced with 9 days left in the legislative session. No opportunity for compromise, no opportunity to put work into it, and it fails, not surprisingly, along party lines. And now, to predict the future, I will tell you that for the next 6 months, we will hear from politicians on both sides saying, I tried, but the Republicans stopped me. And on the other side, we'll hear, I didn't let them take away your guns. Support me in the next election. This issue is too important to be a political football. It should have been introduced at the start of the legislative session so that we could better protect the kids in our community and the community members. When my phone rings in the middle of the night, it's usually because someone has been shot. We need leaders who are going to stand up and protect Colorado. So this morning when I open the Daily Camera and I see a summary of legislation, one of our older legislators says, I strongly supported the ban on bump stocks and red flag law. And the sentence ends there and there's no follow-up. There's no apology for it failing. There's no explanation as to why it was introduced with just 9 days left in the session. And there's no plan going forward. As your district attorney, I'm going to continue to fight gun violence as I have for the last 20 years. Thank you.
Mike Foote, who is running for Democratic candidate for the Boulder County DA.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. And my name is Mike Foote. I'm a candidate for Boulder County District Attorney. I have served at the Boulder County District Attorney's Office since 2004, also a state legislator for the last 6 years representing Eastern Boulder County. So I wanted to come before you this afternoon and talk about gun violence from those two perspectives, from the prosecutor's perspective as well as from a legislator's perspective. Now, that's not the only two perspectives, of course. There are many, many others, societal perspectives, and I think there'll be some questions that we'll get into that'll get into some very interesting discussions about how gun violence can be curbed and or eliminated in certain areas through a societal viewpoint. And I'm here mainly to listen about what people have to say about that, because I have my opinions, but I think we all need to have a much wider discussion about how we can do it from all angles. There's not just one answer. In fact, there's many, many answers. I think, for example, from a prosecutor's perspective, of course, and I think most people would agree with me on this, of course, gun violence cases take a high priority. There's a difference between somebody getting into a fight and taking a wallet from somebody and somebody using a gun to threaten somebody and taking their wallet away as a result of that. And it should be treated that way from a prosecutor's perspective. Certainly I have done it that way. From a legislator's perspective, I can tell you that the gun debates down at the Capitol have been some of the most contentious debates that we've had. The first session that I arrived down at the legislature was 2013. And that was the year that we ended up passing some common sense gun safety reforms. But I can tell you that the folks that were down there in 2013 fought, many of them, the majority of them, thankfully, fought for these gun safety reforms, but ended up, some of them had some of the scars to prove it. The dynamic down at the Capitol is difficult, but it's a dynamic that can be changed. The only way it can be changed, though, is for folks like yourselves and others, and groups like Mom Demands Action, to push back towards what it is. Right now, the dynamic is that the Rocky Mountain gun owners, which, by the way, makes the NRA look moderate, controls the discussion from one side of the aisle. And when we reference the red flag law, I can tell you the only reason that that law didn't pass was because of one group, the Rocky Mountain gun owners. Even the NRA was on board during the discussions before that bill was introduced. And I can tell you that there were all kinds of discussions that were happening behind the scenes to try to get bipartisan agreement before the bill was introduced, because the bill sponsors knew once a bill like that was introduced, everyone would go to their corners. It would be immediately politicized. So there were a lot of good discussions, robust discussions, and as I said, even the NRA was about to sign off on that bill. But the Rocky Mountain gun owners pushed back, locked people down, and the bill ended up failing. So I'm not saying this to make excuses. I'm saying it to talk to people about the dynamics and how they can change. Now, I'll tell you, they have changed going back to 2013. In 2013, I supported and we passed background checks, magazine limitations, temporary confiscation of weapons from domestic violence offenders, and also people paying for their own background checks. Four good pieces of legislation that we passed. But I'll tell you, those of us that were on that side were on our heels the entire time, because the Rocky Mountain gun owners and others have organized very, very well, and they turned out people, and they ended up making their voices heard. Since then, we've had a number of groups that have come forth, like Moms Demand Every Town, and they've balanced it. And I'm very happy to say that that's the case, and the discussions going forward in the legislature will reflect that. You all can help. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Nick Thomas. He's the independent candidate for Congressional House District 2.
Of all the debates and events that we've had and partaken in recently, I think this one has the most significance and far-reaching implications. And I'm really thankful to everybody who did show up today. It's always so sad to me to see such a small room with such an important debate, particularly in such a place like Boulder. But thank every one of you for coming and you guys for putting it on. This issue is far more reaching, complicated, and important than a simple yes or no. And because of that, neither the Democrat nor the Republican Party have had the political will or capacity to deal with the issue. So every time we see one of these major tragedies, the majority of Republicans will tweet out thoughts and prayers. And the majority of Democrats will rail about one piece of legislation or the other and then let it go silent. And nothing changes. Yesterday we passed a milestone on the year where more children have been killed in the United States due to the gun violence than service members. Today, 96 Americans will die from weapons, guns. And double that will have injuries. Today. This society at large is experiencing massive trauma. And we know that plays into it. We know that our history that we have not come to deal with, and the political culture going on right now between black versus blue, red versus blue, and in so many other forms, is not helping. We have normalized violence. We have normalized guns, something that was created in some ways for military, but also in some ways as a tool. We have normalized putting this into video games and putting it into our kids' hands and letting something that my twin and I own shotguns. We go hunting with them, and then we lock them in a safe. My parents are Quaker pacifists in North Boulder. My dad, I'll always remember telling me early on, guns shouldn't exist. Everybody will have their opinion in that realm. Some of us talked about this earlier. But nobody should argue closing a background check loophole. Nobody should argue basic common sense ways of dealing with these weapons. From locking them up to taking control, taking responsibility for them if you own a weapon and your child goes out and shoots with it, or you give it to somebody and they do the same. Nobody should be able to argue that. I started this campaign when I happened to be in D.C. The shooting took place at the congressional baseball practice. Somebody walked up, asked if the field was Democrats or Republicans. The response was they were Republicans. He pulled out a weapon and opened fire. To me, I focused on the tribalism, but a weapon was involved. Ken Toltz, who joined us for a little while, started his campaign because of a shooting. And the final thing I'll say is, growing up in Boulder, I remember when my younger brother was best friends with Burke Ramsey. And that was also a weapon. It is too systematic in our society, period. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you. And now we're going to have Mark Williams, who is a Democratic candidate for Congressional House District 2.
Is mic on? Check, check.
Do you want to take this one?
Hello? Hello?
Oh, there we go.
Hello? Check, check. You can use the one down front. So my name is Mark Williams. I'm a candidate running for Congress. And, there's two important questions for me today. The first is, how come we haven't had the political will to change the rules around guns? The second to me is, why is our society so violent? And these two questions are the critical questions that I think we need to address this afternoon. A little bit about my background. I'm here first and foremost as a father. I have two daughters that are in school right now. My oldest daughter, who's in her second year of college, when I took her the summer before she started her 9th grade down to Boulder High, and we went to the school and I said, "Sweetie, here's what we're going to talk about. If there's a shooting in your school, here's how you're going to exit." And we walked around the school and I showed her where she was going to be able to take cover and how she was going to be able to escape and evade out of that school. That's not something you do in a lot of first world countries. In fact, we might be the only one where you have to do that kind of thing. As a former military person, I understand how deadly weapons are. I understand that when you have a weapon like that at your disposal, you need to be trained in their use because they are that deadly. I understand that an assault weapon is only designed for one thing, and that is to kill people. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. So, for me, as I start looking at this question, and this is a key part of why I'm running for Congress, is why haven't our politicians had the political will to change laws? As these folks have mentioned, most Americans, doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat, doesn't matter whether you're urban or rural, want common sense gun laws, and they want changes to what's happening around guns right now. And so why haven't we been able to do that? Well, for me, the fact of the matter is, like folks have alluded to here, is a lot of career politicians don't have the moral courage to say enough is enough. And generally speaking, it's Republicans, but it's not just Republicans. And what it does is it points to a larger culture in our politics, which is the politics of money and how money drives policy. So whether it's guns, whether it's big pharma, whether it's oil and gas, underneath policies that don't fit with our values as a community or as a country, underneath all that is money that ends up driving the votes that don't actually pursue policies which are for the well-being of the people. And so after 2016 and seeing the deep dysfunction in our politics, that's when I decided to get involved, because it's time for citizen candidates to stand up for their communities and say, yes, we want different kinds of gun laws. And yes, we want different kinds of laws around health. And yes, we want different kinds of laws around the defense budget, because guess what, folks? All these things are tied together. All of these things are tied together. When we have money in politics, when we have a defense budget that drives the militarization of our police, when we have a very war-centered foreign policy, what it does is it grounds us in a violent mentality, and it drives our culture to someplace different. And so if we want to address these, all three of those need to be talked about. Not one of them can be talked on their own. And so for me, the depth of this discussion begins with money, it moves to foreign policy, and it travels to health. And that's how we have to start changing this. Thank you.
Okay, now we're moving into the questions to candidates who have 2 minutes to respond. And again, to remind the candidates, you can respond to the question, you can respond to another candidate's answer, or rebut it, or you can pass on the question if it doesn't apply to your office. So we're going to start with a question from Will.
This is from a list of questions compiled from the input from different civics groups. First question. Most school shootings have been carried out using handguns rather than assault rifles. However, those with assault rifles have harmed more people. Some advocate arming teachers. If elected, what are some politically feasible solutions, in your opinion, that would enhance school safety? Specificity is important.
And I guess Michael will start with you, and then we'll, as we go through the questions, we'll rotate who will go first, but we'll start with you, Michael.
Okay, thank you. I'm strongly opposed to teachers being armed. I have 10-year-old twins who go to public school here in Boulder. They've grown up here in Boulder. I don't want them to be looking at a gun all day long. And I also worry about where that gun's going to be kept if it's not on the hip of the teacher and she or he has 30 kids running around the classroom. There are other steps that we must take to protect school children besides arming our teachers. I think it speaks, though, to the tragedies that we have faced that we're even thinking about arming our teachers. So there's a lot we can do, and there's a lot I've already started doing as your district attorney since taking office on March 1st. I've been working with school safety and with law enforcement to make sure that we have school resource officers in every one of the 56 public schools here in Boulder County. Currently, that's not the case. We should all be reaching out to the schools in our respective areas and asking, do you have a school resource officer? Someone on the ground who's trained, dedicated, and skilled at connecting with kids and also protecting the school. Second is hardening the schools to make sure that they have enough security, to make sure that people can't come and go from the school through side exits and have access to the schools and to our children. So hardening the schools is an important step as well. And working closely with Sheriff Pelly, and I'm honored to have his support in this campaign, to make sure that the school resource officers in the schools are communicating clearly. I think we'll be talking more about Safe to Tell later, but you may not be aware that Safe to Tell, which is a reporting system for bullying for kids and for the threat of school violence for kids, the number of false reports to Safe to Tell made by one kid against another in the St. Vrain Valley School District since the start of the school year, 800. 800 false reports. each one which triggers a massive response from the school and law enforcement. So taking steps to make sure that that system is not abused, but rather it's a safe reporting system for students to protect themselves and others. I'm strongly opposed to arming teachers, but I'm engaged in the fight to protect our kids every single day. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Mike?
All right, thank you very much for the question. Arming teachers, no, that's a terrible idea. I've helped to defeat a bill to actually allow that several times as I've been out of the legislature. And what we hear during the testimony of people coming in is that the teachers really don't want it. But it's really an agenda that's pushed by an extreme gun group or two that think that this is the solution. It's not the solution. And since then, of course, we hear occasionally about a teacher or somebody in a school that has a weapon, it discharges accidentally, there's a problem. We're very concerned about that. We shouldn't do it. That's not the place to go. Now, there are other ways to go about increasing school safety. For example, we have, at the legislature this year, we increased the budget for school safety improvements, particularly of capital in school safety, so that the entrances are fortified, there's security and so forth. I think there's other creative solutions that we can take as well. And one of the solutions I'll highlight in a very short amount of time, since we only have 2 minutes, is a bill that I passed a couple of years ago. And this bill dealt with a mental health professional being able to break confidentiality under the very limited circumstance of if there's a significant threat to a school. This is a very multifaceted issue. It's an issue that involves, of course, patient privacy, wanting people to get mental health counseling in the first place, but also wanting to protect schools. And I think we've arrived at a good solution to thread the needle between all of those considerations. And right now, if you are a mental health professional or know one, they should know that if there is a significant threat to a school, made by anyone, not just a student, but anyone, then that actually can go to the school and be reported so the school can take protective measures. So that's one element of what we can do. We need to do more of that. But I think this really cries out for creative solutions, and I hope that we can come to some of those tonight and other times as well.
Thank you.
So there's this interesting statement. The immediacy of now, it's in politics, the immediacy of now oftentimes blocks out what's most important down the road. Right now, we're talking about an issue that both of those should be impacted by, and yet really nobody on the national stage has done anything either way. With schools, we just heard the Texas governor, I believe it was the governor, mention that the problem there was too many doors. We've heard other pretty arrogant responses that teachers should be armed, principals should be armed, more police, fewer police. At the debate yesterday, which you guys put on, and by the way, thank you for doing the gubernatorial debate with Never Again yesterday. Somebody said every single school should have a metal detector going in. Every single school nationwide. That is a horrific idea. To me, if we continue down this culture where everything gets worse and worse, and we're dealing with the solution, excuse me, what was it you said earlier? You had a great. If we're not dealing with the initial problem rather than dealing with the outcome, we just will keep tumbling, just as we've seen at TSA. So in schools, I'll tell you the first thing, there's no question, teachers should not be armed unless there's certain areas, in mountainous areas or in Texas, where they choose this is the safest way, they can go figure that one out. That's local control. But in general, it makes everybody less safe. And I know, having done security in the past, that anybody who uses a weapon for safety or for precaution needs to be constantly training with it, practicing with it, and in reality, most people who carry weapons, I'm not going to argue with a woman who carries a weapon in a handbag to make her feel safer, but in reality, it's putting her at more risk. And certainly, we don't want that with the children.
Thank you. Mark?
So, I'm on board with what Michael and Mike have said, just in terms of school resource officers. And let me explain to you why it makes no sense to arm a teacher. So one of the things that I've done in my life is I teach special operators, SWAT folks, law enforcement, firefighters, first responders, how to keep their higher functioning cognitive process online under extreme duress. And so I'm at the intersection of mindfulness and high performance. And I've been in places where we teach these kinds of folks, special operations community and SWAT folks, how to handle very intense shooters and even active shooter scenarios. If somebody is not trained to an extremely high degree, their ability to handle an active shooter scenario is just about zero. Now, my heart went out to that officer in Parkland because what ends up happening in a lot of these situations is you go into a fight, flight, or freeze response. And the fact of the matter is, most people are going to freeze under that level of intensity. The last thing that we want are school teachers who get some kind of crash course in this, and all of a sudden they have a weapon in their room, and the kind of scenario happens where somebody shows up there, all you're going to do is set up a situation for a disaster. So the idea that you can have school teachers armed, the idea that a school teacher's primary function would be managing an active shooter scenario instead of teaching children, the idea that most of them have the capacity to do this when even well-trained SWAT officers and special forces folks, this is at the limit of what they can do, it's a terrible, terrible idea. And other solutions need to be brought to the table instead of this kind of nonsense.
Okay, thank you. Okay, this time we'll start with Mike, and I'm going to ask the question. Many gun rights advocates fear that registration and or licensing of gun owners would lead to the government taking away their firearms. What are the pros and cons of registration and licensing? What would you do concerning these two issues if elected to office?
I think I'll take the first part of that first, which is that the gun licensing and confiscation is such a hot topic issue, and unfortunately what it's used for is the old slippery slope argument that is never a very good argument, but certainly many gun advocacy groups use. They say, well, this is just one small step all the way to the end where it's gun licensing and confiscation. Background checks, magazine limitations, red flag, etc. I don't think it's a realistic proposition to say that these things will happen. I think that it should be debunked, and I think that we should make sure that we do whatever we can to show the fallacy of that type of argument, because it's used time and time again. It's used by the advocacy groups that try to gin up opposition to these common sense gun measures, and I don't think that we should accept it. Now, maybe other countries do this. I don't see it happening here in the United States, but what I do see happening would be things like the red flag laws that we have in the 9 states so far and that we should have here in Colorado. That is a temporary gun confiscation type of law. It's there after due process. It's there after a lot of steps taken through the court, and it's there for a good reason. And it also is something that works. It's been shown to work in other states that have it. The law that was proposed here in Colorado actually has more due process than any of the other states have. For example, I'll say this kind of tongue-in-cheek, the very blue state of Indiana has a red flag law that doesn't even have the courts involved at the beginning. It's just law enforcement can seize a weapon. So that's a long way of saying that I think that we should focus on common sense measures that can reduce the violence and make sure we break that link with the slippery slope, go forward to make sure we can put these in place.
Thank you. Nick?
So I'll simplify this by saying I think I basically understood everything you just said and would agree with Mike Foot on all of that. So let me take it a step further. Here's another great example of how our politicians have failed us. in our culture of tribalism has failed us. One of the organizations that was actually pretty active and helpful in some of the earliest common sense gun legislation was the NRA. What has happened? A lot of these organizations have basically doubled down, gone extreme across the board, but the NRA is one of the best examples of that. Being a shotgun owner with my twin, I would have loved to have a pistol when I was younger. I have no need now. But when we were talking about hunting one day, I read about a gun safety a piece of technology where it reads a fingerprint. This was nearly 10 years ago. The gun could read your fingerprint, and only that person who owned it could use it. It was somewhere around New Jersey or something that they passed legislation that said you cannot create this technology. Why? Because the NRA was afraid that if this very smart technology were to come out, then all guns would be required to use that very smart technology. And so why not just keep it from everyone? It's the same idea as not doing any of this research on it in the first place, although that's finally passed in the 2018 budget. We have this terrible tribalism that is keeping our politicians, and massive respect to Mark, I really believe he would thwart that. But most politicians in Congress, most politicians around our system simply fall in line and won't deal with these very difficult structures.
So what I'll say is that you have to register your car to drive it. It seems like you should register a gun to own it. We don't willy-nilly take away cars. We don't willy-nilly take away guns. And so when I hear this argument that the government is going to come take our guns, let's look at the history of this argument. This is something right out of the John Birch Society. This is something from the extreme right wing that was saying way back in the early 1900s and then into the 40s and 50s. And then it burst out into the body politic again with Goldwater and finally came crashing into us with Reagan. The NRA changed from a gun safety group in 1977 when the Cincinnati takeover occurred. And it's been since then that the dialogue of the far right, something that once upon a time would have been laughed at and scoffed at as being completely unreasonable, to think that the government is going to come and take our weapons, right? And now that's become part of the mainstream conversation. How did that happen, folks? How has it become the case that we've become so distrustful of our government that that far right-wing lie and that scare tactic has become actually part of the mainstream political conversation? That's something we have to ask ourselves. And as I look at the breakdown of how politicians have been representing us, I think Nick has hit it on the head when he says we have lost faith in our politicians. We have lost faith in the folks that are governing our country. And that loss of faith has translated into this very individual, I will get mine and I will protect myself from a government that's not there for me. And that's what we need to be addressing as the future of politics.
Michael.
2 years ago, Friday night, 10 o'clock, I get a call from a police chief who tells me, Michael, I need you to listen to this voicemail for me and tell me what to do. And it's a voicemail from a man who says, quite carefully, I'm not threatening you, but you and city council need to know that you're going to be killed. You're going to be shot. Not by me, but I just want you to know that's going to happen real soon. And the police chief says, what can I do? We think he has guns, but we're not sure. What action can we take? We have no knowledge of whether he actually has guns, and based on that phone call alone, there's nothing we could do in a state that does not have a red flag law to go get the guns that the guy actually did have. In fact, he had 3 firearms in his possession. So 2 days later, I'm with my kids walking down the street thinking, that guy could be here. That guy could be here. So In a state where we're unable to have the politicians at the State House introduce the red flag law until the very last hour of the legislative session, January, February, March, and April all roll by, and then they introduce a bill named after Zachary Parrish, who was killed on New Year's. I don't see registration and licensing happening in this state anytime soon. But I agree with Mark. I think if I asked my daughter when it was time to take her road test to go with me to the DMV, and she said, you know, cars don't kill people, people kill people, I don't need to get a license, I don't think I'd be allowing her to drive. So, but I also think this question cuts deeper, which is about restoring integrity in government and allowing people to realize that there are leaders with integrity who are going to speak truthfully and honestly and directly to questions, even if people are going to disagree with them. I think we need to have those conversations now, and that's why I'm so glad we're here today. Because we need leaders with integrity, not politicians, to reduce and fight against gun violence. We have too much of it. So registration and licensing, sure, it makes sense to me. But we can't pass a red flag law. I don't see it happening right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the candidates. Now, Caroline, could you come up and ask a question?
Where should I go up to?
Oh. Just up to the mic.
Mark it, but
Hello? I'll just hold this. Okay, so my question is, what will you do to address police brutality and to uplift communities of color who are facing disproportionate rates of gun violence?
Okay, Nick, why don't you start this time?
Sure. Every one of these questions is going to delve back to our culture and where we're taking it, and also how we treat smart legislation. I have a friend in Chicago who I visited often, and that's where I learned the expression Chirac. Due to the gun violence and the gang violence in Chicago, it was Chirac. A lot of us weren't impacted by that idea in the same way because we live in a more docile, luckily, until certain things rose up, part of the country. But this has been going on for a very, very, very long time. Police brutality. Let me hit that so I don't run out of time because this is important. There are 2 states in this country, 2 states that require training for police officers to use force as a last resort. And there are 34 states that don't have any sort of requirement or setup whatsoever. I have a lot of police officers who are good friends. A guy named Mike, who's probably pulled over some of you on 36. Most of the people getting into this profession of service are good people. There are a certain amount of bad apples. However, if you bring good people into a program which is based on some fundamentals of war, as Mark said, where it's war on our streets, and you don't train them, like everywhere else in the world, to use force as a last resort, what do you expect? We have a distance to go.
So I think at this point in our history, there's nothing that we can say that denies a deep and long history of racism in our country. That was baked into our Constitution. And that's an original sin that we have that we've got to change. And only now do I really finally believe that that dialogue is happening. With some of the videos we've seen with police officers, whether it's San Francisco, whether it's in Carolina, finally the evidence is before us, and there can be no more denying that racism is playing such a large part, and that the law enforcement community, generally speaking, good folks, but that law enforcement community a lot of times has been part of the repression apparatus that's been involved with the racism in this country. What can we do to change that? You know, Nick alluded to it. We are one of the only countries in the world that doesn't have first world countries that doesn't have a standardized national training program that runs for all police folks. And that needs to be implemented, because when it happens at the local level, unfortunately, certain kinds of training get lost. One of the things that I've seen, again, is when people don't have the ability to understand when they're operating under duress, the first response, unfortunately, of somebody who has a weapon is to go towards that weapon. And so when you start seeing the unconscious biases that are baked into somebody because of what we see in our popular culture with people of color being, generally speaking, portrayed as criminals, then you have police officers who the first thing they're going to do under duress, because they haven't been trained otherwise, is to start grabbing a weapon. So these things need to be addressed, again, at so many different levels. And the first and most critical step is to acknowledge the history that we have in our country, and then proceed from that acknowledgement and go, how do we work with these real-world biases and a culture that continues that so that we can change the culture of a police department?
Thank you. Michael?
The justice system should be equal for all. And throughout my career, I've been fighting against police brutality and to improve how just our justice system actually is. So I'll tell you that as a prosecutor in downtown Manhattan on 9/11, in the months that followed, there was a police officer who took a Middle Eastern man behind a construction fence and smashed him in the face repeatedly with his police radio. And I had the duty of prosecuting that case. And throughout my 20 years as a prosecutor, I have prosecuted police officers who've broken the law. In fact, here in Boulder, as a special prosecutor on behalf of Stan Garnett, he had to take his office off the case because they had a connection with a Boulder police detective. In 2014, he asked me to take that case as a special prosecutor, and that case went to trial, and I successfully prosecuted that detective. So it's about sending a message to law enforcement that we're all accountable to law, that there's no special exceptions. I also have been asked to teach anti-bias policing throughout the state. Over the last couple of years, we had the legislature and the governor enact a law a couple of years ago for anti-bias policing. We need to do more of that. We also need to look within our own offices. So as district attorney, I have implicit bias training for my staff. I once asked 70 attorneys, because I teach ethics for prosecutors, I once asked 70 attorneys in a room much like this, this is actually a church, so a room much like this, I asked, how many of you think there's bias in the criminal justice system? And every hand went up. I said, how many of you think you have ever acted with bias in your jobs? And not one hand went up. And that's the gap right there. So closing that gap by studying the data, making sure we're never, when it comes to arrest, charging, plea offers, diversion, that we're treating people equally as something that I've done in the past, and I'm doing as your district attorney currently, and making sure that we have justice for all. But it's about working with law enforcement to make sure that as district attorney, that we will never tolerate police brutality, ever. So I stand by my record on that, and I'm excited to do that as your district attorney. Thank you.
Mike?
Thank you. The bottom line, it's pretty simple. There should be zero tolerance for police brutality, none. And I'm thankful that we've been able to develop more body cam availability and the higher usage of it. That's something that we've worked on at the state level over the last couple of years and that I've supported because it gives us the evidence that we need to prosecute these types of cases. And I'm very thankful for that because before that, of course, you're relying upon one word or two words or the words of others, and it's just much better to have it in front of you. We've all seen videos, not necessarily body cam videos, but we've seen videos that tells the story. And we need to tolerate police brutality no more at all. It should be prosecuted. Now, I want to bring up just one other thing that hasn't been brought up by anybody else, which is that our process as well around the state in some areas for violations of policy that don't necessarily rise to the level of something that's prosecutable, I think are broken as well. You hear about some departments in the metro area where a police officer that violates policy and does something that may not quite be a violation of the law, but a violation of policy that could lead to brutality, and they get chance after chance after chance, due process after due process after due process. By the time the whole thing is done 3 years later, they've kept their job for 3 years, and then people pretty much just collapse of exhaustion because they're just done with it. And this process needs to be much better. There needs to be process in place, of course, for officers, but I think there needs to be reforms that address this issue as well. We need to nip it in the bud before it gets to something that should be prosecuted.
Okay, thank you. Shane, I'm sorry.
Suicide followed by domestic violence are the most frequent causes of gun deaths. What policies, programs, or legislation will you propose to address these two issues?
Okay, Mark.
So it's appropriate that my daughter asked me the question. Thank you, Shay. Let me start with the suicide piece, and this one actually really hits close to home. And we had a friend of ours who was suffering from depression and mental illness, and she'd had suicidal ideation, and then one day it came on full force, and just life presented in a certain way, and she went down to a gun shop, and the situation unfolded just like we're talking about. And as the community and as the neighborhood processed this death, which hit all of us like a freight train, we started asking ourselves, first of all, what did we miss? What could we have done differently? Did we miss some signs? And then secondly, it was, boy, would it have made a difference if there was a waiting period? Because she had quite literally gone down to the store and bought a weapon, come home, dropped off her young daughter, and then she went out into the field, and that was that. So I think in terms of suicide, it goes back to the question of mental health, and it goes back to the question of, let's just not make it that easy. Let's have a waiting period. Let's put those kinds of things in place. And then when it comes to domestic violence, again, for me, what I start seeing is people's incapacity to have the emotional understanding of what's going on there, and then what are the stressors inside of that family that are creating that level of intensity where people turn to that as some kind of rational response. And then the availability of a gun in that scenario is a recipe for disaster.
So, okay to clap. Go ahead.
Wasn't sure if you were coming back down the road. Shay, thank you for the question. Is my mic on still? No. All right. So, we are currently 5th in the nation in suicides. Colorado is 5th in the nation. So it's about community outreach and community education around gun safety, but to dovetail something Mark said, it's about mental health. So I'm excited to share with you that Sheriff Pelly and I are launching a pilot program for mental health, a mental health diversion program for individuals who come into the jail. They're going to be diverted out of the jail within 72 hours, provided they've been arrested on a low-level offense and they have a significant mental health issue. The state has agreed to give us the funding, and the governor, the chief judge for Boulder, the Boulder public defender, and I are in agreement that Boulder will be a pilot site. So we're going to have that up and running by July to give people the mental health treatment they need instead of letting them remain in jail and decompensate and not get the treatment they need. When it comes to domestic violence, I've prosecuted individuals. I've prosecuted hundreds upon hundreds of domestic violence cases, but I've also prosecuted cases where domestic violence offenders try to obtain or possess firearms after the court has told them it's prohibited because of a pending domestic violence case or conviction for domestic violence. We need to do more. Currently, it's too easy for domestic violence offenders to simply transfer their firearm to a family member or a friend while a case is pending. And there's no mechanism for law enforcement to go get the gun when the case is pending. We need to do more to protect domestic violence offenders. As someone who's been a dedicated prosecutor for 20 years, I've handled too many domestic violence homicides where there are warning signs along the way. And we should have been able to do more to protect those victims from being killed. So mental health efforts to prevent suicides from happening both at the community level, but also having a mental health diversion program, and in domestic violence cases, making sure law enforcement and prosecutors have the tools they need to continue to fight for victims as I have done throughout my career. Thank you.
So, by the way,
Sorry. No worries. Okay, first of all, I agree with the waiting period. I think that should be implemented. I think that will save lives. I think that when it comes to domestic violence, actually one of our local police chiefs here in the county says it very well. When somebody asks him, do you think that this place is a safe place to live? And his response is, it's not really where you live, it's who you live with. And that really, I think, encapsulates what we're talking about with domestic violence. And with these domestic violence victims, it's almost never just one instance. It's a cycle of violence that the victim cannot escape from for whatever reason. There's not enough support, financial reasons, kids, you name it, that the perpetrator uses against the victim. So we don't have a very good support system. We certainly have some processes here in Boulder County, some groups in Boulder County that do a very good job, and I've worked with them. We need to do better, though, because there are a number of victims that still, and certainly over the course of the time that I prosecuted these cases, will tell me, I just couldn't get out of it for a variety of reasons. Now, you all may be familiar with a building or a group called the Blue Sky Bridge Child Advocacy Center. It's just actually just a little bit north of here in Boulder. Myself and my wife have been very involved with it. It's for children, those under 18 that are possible victims of sexual assault and sexual abuse. And that group recently expanded their mission. They used to just do forensic interviewing to make sure that the child could come in and tell their story, and that it was something that could be more likely to be prosecuted if the evidence supported that. But they've recently expanded their mission so that they would provide support, treatment, and everything that they can possibly need as a result of being abused on-site or referring it to a place immediately off-site. So almost a one-stop shop type of place. I think we need to do that with domestic violence. Other jurisdictions do that. Denver in particular has done that, and I think we can expand it to Boulder.
so as a quick FYI, this whole thing is being live streamed, so if anybody wants to look back at it or knows anybody who's not here, I know it's being shared there. We've got it shared on our page, Nick Thomas on the Facebook one, or nickthomasforcongress.com. On my last comment, I wanted to add in, of those 2 states that teach non-lethal weapons training, those are Georgia and Tennessee. Georgia and Tennessee, not Colorado. And of the 34 states, let me find this stat, this is important. 34 states that do not even require de-escalation training, Colorado's one of them. So I challenge all of us to keep pushing our legislators on fixing that one. We should be leading the way. Another statistic specifically on this question is Colorado is 6th in suicides. Of the 50 states, we're 6th as of 2012. 50% of children and 60% of adults do not get treatment, or I think this is a 2017 one, did not get treatment for mental illness. So that also is a major issue. This is what I said at the beginning. This is such a complex, critical issue that we focus on every one of these. But I will say, I believe I was the only candidate that wasn't on stage to go and join Andrew Romanoff at the mental health event 2 months ago in Denver. I was asked by one of the candidates, why are you here? This isn't your district. My God, man. It affects everyone. And it blew me away that other people from around the state weren't there, unless they were specializing in mental health. This issue affects all of us. It affects the violence we see in schools. Bullying is often a symptom of mental health. Technology, what we're holding all these cameras, they're beautiful, they're wonderful, but we've all heard this. The more you have social media, oftentimes, the more you feel disconnected from the real parts of society, from real people. We have major issues in this area, and there are very few people actually taking it on. And if we had more than 2 minutes on each of these subjects, we could get into it. Thank you for being here.
Okay, we've had several questions from the audience around the Second Amendment, so I'm going to put a few of these together and maybe ask a cogent question on this. First of all, it has to do with, should we keep it or repeal it? Should we amend it? And how do we deal with Second Amendment rights? So, keep it, amend it, repeal it, Second Amendment.
I think we're back to you, Michael, to start. Unless we want to come back the other way.
You guys tell me.
Go ahead.
Part of the issue here is that there were people in the country, in particular the Republican Party, that hatched a fairly cunning plan to get this issue before the U.S. Supreme Court. And it's since those decisions from about 10 years ago that we've seen a significant expansion of one's rights to possess firearms. So when we talk about keeping, amending, repealing, what I look at is the U.S. Supreme Court and how that process was used or manipulated to allow for the expansion of gun rights. So I think we could do a lot to improve how we handle this in the United States. And I take issue with anybody who tells me there's no limitation on any amendment, because when you look at most of the amendments that we have to our Constitution, there are limitations upon them. The Constitution is a living document and it's changed over time. So I don't think we should look at it and say that it can be read one way to allow people to possess firearms anytime, everywhere they want. Much like freedom of speech, there are limitations on freedom of speech. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. It's logical and reasonable for us to put limitations in place. So keeping, amending, repealing, what I would advocate for is that we put limitations in place on the Second Amendment, along the lines of what we've been discussing here, to reduce the gun violence in this country. I think we absolutely must do that. And I don't think we have to repeal the Second Amendment to get there, although I appreciate the passion that we feel about this. But it's been the expansion of the Second Amendment that's having a direct impact that brings us all here today. I think limitations can and should be put in place, such as the red flag law, a ban on assault weapons. Those are limitations that when the founders passed the Second Amendment, I don't think they thought that someday people would have access to machine guns, that people would be shooting police officers and shooting community members in the street. That's why the Constitution is a living document. We should have and must have limitations to reduce gun violence in this country. Thank you.
Well, first of all, what we need is a better Supreme Court. The Supreme Court that gave us the 2008 Heller decision is also the same one that gave us the 2010 Citizens United decision. One of the two worst decisions that we've seen over the course of decades in our jurisprudence. Now, I think that the Heller decision in 2008, of course, was groundbreaking in expansion. Certainly the gun advocacy groups think that it was and treat it that way. But there's a lot of information within Heller that allows us to still put in reasonable restrictions and reasonable limitations. Justice Scalia, the late Justice Scalia, who wrote the opinion, even said the Second Amendment doesn't allow anyone to have any weapon for any reason. It just doesn't. You can't have a tank, you can't have a bazooka, you can't have these things. And so the Second Amendment jurisprudence that we have now is pretty clear that reasonable restrictions like assault weapons bans, magazine limitations, background checks, and a host of other things like red flag laws are all constitutional. Now, we've gone through this litigation here in Colorado after the 2013 laws were passed, particularly about the magazine limitation, and the gun advocacy groups lost. They're constitutional. So we can still do a lot of things under even the current interpretation of the Heller decision in 2008 and some of the subsequent decisions that we've seen from the Supreme Court. We just have to make sure that we get them passed politically. Congress, state legislatures, and so forth. That's not, so I don't think the Supreme Court is providing a huge roadblock to what can be done. I just think that it's something that the legislatures and the Congress have to work with and make it happen.
Yeah, I would echo both of the mics on that one. Last night, we were at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society Gala, this big fundraiser they do every year. And a gentleman came up to me, I was wearing the tag, and said, "Oh, you're running. Where?" I said, "The 2nd District." So what do you think about guns? I said, "Ironically, we're going to have this debate tomorrow. You should come." And he was suddenly, in this intense, a very docile, enjoyable event, he was suddenly intense, and you could see he was emotional and angry. And he said, "I'm one of the fathers from Columbine. Look at what happened with Heller. Have you read over that? Have you seen this, that, and the other?" We talked briefly, and in that moment, and I've carried it through today, so I apologize that I've probably, it's visible. This is such a sad thing to talk about, because it's this massive issue that we are not coming to terms with in our political system. But that law and so many other laws are not what the majority of American people are looking for. When we talk about closing simple gun show loopholes, when we talk about a proper red flag law, when we talk about a lot of these basic common sense ideas, the statistics show us 78 to 92% of Americans are behind them. But the money interests and the political will continue to block them again and again. And I'll take issue with one of the statements that was made. That's why I wish everybody would show up and we could have a proper conversation. "I am the only congressman who could deal with this." Right there, boy, that upsets me, that you would make that alone an argument for why to vote for me. I am the only congressman that will take this to D.C. There's 435 seats in the House, 100 in the Senate. We've had time after time, every 2 years there's somebody, and yet this is where we still are.
Yeah.
Can you believe what they're going to say?
So, I agree with Michael and with Mike also, just in terms of what's happened with the Supreme Court decision. I will disagree a little bit with Mike, though, in terms of saying, well, you know, Justice Scalia's jurisprudence has left us in a place where we can still make some forward momentum, some forward gains in the world of gun laws. I disagree fundamentally with that, because what I think that decision did was it moved the goalpost significantly. You know, the other thing that happened also was the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act in 2005. Do folks know what that is? Well, you know, it's not enough to say, well, we need a well-regulated militia, and that's what you can have arms for. Now, with the Helen decision, it's about every individual gets a gun, but with this other clause that the Congress passed, it means you can't litigate against gun makers. So one of the avenues that we had to go against big tobacco was the litigation process, and then going through that litigation process and exposing the willful act by the tobacco industry to poison people. So we can't do that with the gun lobby or the gun industry, because that has been passed. And it goes back to, again, the shift to the right. The Second Amendment is not the problem. The founders were very clear that it was about a well-regulated militia. It wasn't about everybody walking around with a 6-shooter on their hip. That's not what it was about. So, you know, moving to the right, like they did with that decision, and then cutting off other venues to go after guns, that's what politicians in this country have left us with. And that's why we need ordinary folks to step in and say, enough is enough.
Okay, Shay, we're going to have you ask another question.
She had to go to a babysitting gig.
Oh. Okay, I'll ask it. Males commit 89% of all gun violence, and most mass shooters grow up in homes lacking a male figure. What could be done through your office to address this phenomenon?
Stop war.
Mike.
Well, first of all, what we need to make sure that we can do to the extent is at all possible is make sure that males are not in the criminal justice system to begin with. There are a number of people that come in, and I'll just say males and females, but mostly males, that come in the juvenile justice system, or young adults that come into the system after they're 18. And in some systems, instead of diverting them out, focusing on treatment, we start a process that then feeds upon itself where they have a criminal record. And we have a vicious cycle where the criminal record leads to collateral consequences. Collateral consequences leads to lack of housing, lack of employment. And we go on down the line where then sometimes that leads to further offending. So particularly, I can tell you, at least after myself and some of my friends, I know that we turned 25, we were done with all of that. And if we can keep people out of the system to the extent possible before that age, then that's going to make a big difference. And I think here in Boulder County, certainly I've done a lot of that in my work as a prosecutor. We can do more. We can always focus more on it. I think it's actually better here than it is in many jurisdictions. We can expand diversion programs, we can expand restorative justice, we can expand other programs that take people out of the system or keep them from getting in the system in the first place. And making sure that we don't lead to where so many are incarcerated and the single family households and some of the things that you mentioned there. So we can do it, we can continue to do better here in Boulder.
Thank you.
Well, 2 points on this. One is young males in our culture. One of the other candidates mentioned this in his piece, and I appreciated that. This is a major issue. This is part of this whole cultural thing. This is a major issue. And I was going to say something important, and I will probably tell you it later. But for now, I was a Boy Scout right over here, Troop 72. I was proud to become an Eagle Scout. And I thought of it as this amazing experience with a bunch of good guys and camping. But I'll tell you, I also noticed that there were posters all over the wall for which military branch we could go into. And I knew a lot of my buddies did. And I respect them for their choice. But there are so many parts of our society that are based on war. They're based on teaching, particularly young men, preparing them for war. There's I work with the Martin Luther King Center, and I was out with Ambassador Andrew Young in MLK Day, and he endorsed our campaign, and I deeply appreciated that. He talks about this issue a lot. But we happened to be at the Carter Center for the event. And he mentioned how proud he was to work for Jimmy Carter because during our last 40, 50 years, the only time, probably longer, the only time we were not in some sort of armed conflict was the 4 years during Jimmy Carter's presidency. And right now, I think we have 11 consistent conflicts going on. When we live in a culture where normalized war and normalized violence and normalized gun use is a thing, we will continue to have it.
There's, both of these gentlemen, I think, reflect the complexity of this question. And
Mic up.
the other thing that I want to bring to bear is, the question of how many of these young men that have committed these kinds of crimes come from families that may be single parent, right? Or a broken family. And again, over and over and over, we come back to issues of mental health. We come back to issues of support. If somebody is in a single household, generally speaking, it's a mother raising children, right? How much are we there as a society to support that person's struggle trying to raise their children? And what I would submit is if you look at the ecosystem that's available right now for parents that are trying to do that, it's woefully inadequate. It's woefully inadequate if you're not professional and you can't hire somebody to help you, what are you left with then is a child that's pretty much on their own. And if you look at it, you know, the young men from those kinds of backgrounds double the incidence of violence than kids that don't come from that background. And so, you know, for me, the bigger question then becomes, what's the social safety net that we've constructed? Is it doing right by the people of our country? Is it doing right by the people of our country where somebody is a single parent, they can't afford child care, they can't get their kids to pre-K, they're barely making a living, they probably don't have health care, and even if they do have health care, they may not even be able to get their kids the kind of care they need because they can't get away from work without threat of losing their job. So this goes through so many dimensions, folks, and that's why it's so important to see this not just as a question of the violence of guns. It's a question of how are we doing by those that have less opportunity in our culture.
Sorry, I just remembered, and thank Mark for this. The #1 predictor in our society of impact by gun violence is poverty, period. And that is so important to understand that as well.
I'm passionate about criminal justice reform, and I've been fighting to make the system better for many, many years, and I'm going to continue doing it as your district attorney. It's why I've started diversion programs, restorative justice programs, and also problem-solving courts in the last 5 years, helping get a veterans treatment court, a mental health court, and a drug recovery court up and running. We need to bring those to Boulder, and I can promise you that's exactly what I'm going to do. In 2012, I helped lead the effort on behalf of the state prosecutors for Senate Bill 250, drug sentencing reform. I did that along with Representative Claire Levy, and I'm honored to have her endorsement for this campaign. But we need to do a lot more. There's one number that drives me, and it's 50%. 50% of everybody released from state prison is back in state prison within 3 years. That's an absolute failure to the offenders, the victims, the community, and the taxpayers. We are failing them every time we allow that to happen. So I will continue to call for a ban on private prisons in the state of Colorado. Our legislators gave $78 million of our taxpayer money to 3 private prisons last year. Those prisons house 20% of our inmate population in the state of Colorado. They've been demonstrated to have a lower success rate of rehabilitating people. But in an effort to save a dime, in the short term, we're running up long-term costs for the state of Colorado because we continue to have this recidivism rate. Because the private prisons have every reason to put the money in their pocket and not into programs to help people get to a better place. Right. And as a prosecutor for 20 years, I've handled my share of horrific cases. But the vast majority of people who come into the criminal justice system just need help getting back on the right track. That's how the system should work. That's how I'm committed to making it work. We need to ban private prisons and help people get rehabilitated and not continue to warehouse people. Thank you.
We're just trying to figure out, we've got time for, if we feel finished by 4 o'clock, which is what we told you we would, we have time for one more question, so.
And there have been so many good questions from the audience. And looking at the questions from the civic groups, it's really frustrating trying to decide which ones to ask. So what I would say is hopefully some of the candidates can stay after. Some of you folks who didn't get your questions answered up here, you'll be able to speak with them.
Maybe read several of the questions and let the candidates answer
individually, or I could just volunteer to take one.
Mine is basically compare actually need to fracking.
Well,
Because they are connected. Right?
Okay, well, we're just going to go forward. I mean, we could be here all night if the candidates wanted. Because there are a lot of questions, but I think, you know, you've really covered a lot of ground here on specifics and generalities. And so this next one is kind of a general statement. It's been addressed to some degree, but and then after this we'll have 2 minutes for closing statement as well. This one is, some argue that the root cause of gun violence is a culture that has become self-centered and greedy rather than one where everyone is treated with respect. If elected, what policies, programs, or legislation would you propose to change this, if you think it's true? Okay, so I think we're back to Nick. Are we? Yeah, Nick, to start.
So, I'm sorry, I didn't fully understand the question.
All right,
You're
let me
saying
read it
how
again.
to...
I'll read it again. Some argue that the root cause of gun violence is a culture that has become self-centered and greedy rather than one where everyone is treated with respect. If elected, what policies, programs, or legislation would you propose to help change this, if you think it's true?
So basically a question based on my opening. Yes, our culture is fragmented. We're dealing with trauma. Trauma we have not dealt with from slavery. We just had in southwestern Colorado, I apologize if I'm wrong, the 80th anniversary or something of the Japanese internment camp. No, it couldn't be 80. But anyway, we had the anniversary of the Japanese internment camp, which we had right here. We had our own Manzanar in Colorado. Jim Crow. We have so many issues in society that we will not address today, but we continue to deal with the trauma today. And with that, we have this rise in ego and self. We've always had that a little bit. Some of it makes us the great country that we are, and some of it makes it pretty terrible. Either way, I guess legislatively, one of the best ways I can think of starting to fundamentally deal with this issue is I have proposed a service requirement, not necessarily that you have to do it, but every 18-year-old child in this country, when you turn 18, you either go join the military, if that's your choice, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, that's fine, or you serve your country via expanded Peace Corps, expanded AmeriCorps, expanded Teach for America, or go to college. That's fine. Or go to trade school. And by the way, we don't talk about trade school enough. We also say college or nothing. But I think if every child in this country who turned 18 had to go do something to serve their country and create skills, you, one, would come away with the ability to hold a job. And in some areas, we don't have that ability for some kids. And also, in some ways, you would teach people to, again, care about their fellow person, care about serving again, and remind them how critical respect is. Thank you.
So, that's absolutely part of the problem. Nick is pointing to it, just in terms of the fragmentation in the body politic and the people's disconnection from their community and their country in general. And so, for me, it's like I can't fix that by telling you you're going to be a nicer person or anything like that. But what I can do is give people a sense that the process is there for them and the government is governing for them. And that's why I keep pointing back to money in politics and the absolutely corrosive effect of money in politics. In this progressive district, I think we can start showing the way forward by refusing to take money, the dirty money that corrupts politics. So right now, of the Democrats that are running in this race, I'm the only one that's not taking money from the DC insiders, from PACs, special interests, or lobbyists. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want to be able to represent my constituents without them having any doubt that I'm standing forward for them. Now, the system is so broken, that there's a PAC from a law firm in Denver that gives money to Republicans and Democrats